Potting soil. It's winter or fall, and it's time to determine how you're going to store your potting soil because it actually does matter. If you don't know who I am, my name is Ashley and I garden with science along with the rest of the geek crew. And when it comes to potting soil, particularly the potting soil you've placed outdoors, the rules of science do apply still. What we're going to look at is how to determine which way you need to store the potting soil based on what you've planted, diseases or issues you've seen, all the way to what conditions you're actually exposed to. Because while this is a Canadian channel, I try to give tips and tricks for everyone all over the world. Whether you decide to take those tips or tricks, completely up to you. There are no rules in gardening. Newsflash. So if you've seen my video on how to revitalize potting soil, you've obviously seen me put it into a kiddie pool and say, this is where I store said potting soil. And that is true so long as it is the majority of kind of my ornamental plants. So step one to determining how to store your potting soil is actually what plants that soil was exposed to. Now the reason for this actually comes down to the fact that we are crop rotating when it comes to the potting soil itself. So crop rotation is important. First off, it increases the biodiversity within the rhizosphere, which is a very fancy way of saying every plant has a very specific set of microbes it attracts, and therefore, if you're cycling, you get more biodiversity within that space. Make sense? Okay, great. So that is number one reason. The other reason for actually cycling your crops comes down to the fact that there is disease, pests, and other issues that may occur when you plant the same crop over and over and over again. Now, this theory is slightly argued by other people in the community, and that is because the world of Eileen Ingham, aka the soil food web world, the idea is to actually continuously crop the same thing over and over again. The idea being that you will increase the beneficials. But my opinion, and from what I've seen on an agricultural scale, both in my career and private life, is that it tends to actually make things worse for not only the beneficials, which is good, but obviously the bad guys as well. So number one is determining what you've planted and where. Now, once you've determined this, you can separate accordingly. So mine, for ornamentals, goes into my blue kiddie pool. I put anything and everything that falls under the description of flowers. Now, when it comes to fruits, vegetables, and other things that have produce associated with them, and particularly higher levels of disease such as tomatoes or peppers or root veg, I actually do leave those inside of their initial containers because it's a great way for me to remember that I planted tomatoes in said bucket and therefore that soil is exposed to that vegetable. If you've had no issues, you may choose to just not determine where that soil was used before, and that is completely fine. But if you have noticed issues and you're thinking to yourself, well, I actually had a very severe level of blight in my tomatoes this year, and I'm not sure if I can reuse that potting soil, what you actually may want to consider is sterilization. Now, I know you're saying, Ashley, you've repeatedly told us for houseplants and everything in between, do not sterilize. And that rule still holds true because when we sterilize, we're not just removing the bad guys, we're also removing the good guys along with it. And that's why sterilization is kind of one of those cost benefits that you need to think of for yourself. Now, potting soil is expensive, so I can see why you would want to sterilize in the event that you had an issue of some sort. And let's use blight in this case as an example, because that is definitely something that can overwinter, particularly if the root mass or any bits and bobs of that plant is able to kind of overwinter inside of that soil. So the best way to sterilize on a mass level, such as a large volume of potting soil, is actually to use something called solarization. So solarization, I've spoken about in the concept of actually using it in the garden, in ground, or in raised beds, but the same theory applies to actually using it in your container gardens or inside of your potting soil. Now, the best way to achieve this is to actually remove the potting soil, fluff it up, and put it into some plastic bags that are see-through. So see-through versus colored or black plastic actually makes a pretty big difference, and See-through tends to give us the best drying power, for lack of a better term, and therefore the most die-off. Now, regardless of whether you've had very noticeable disease or issues or not, just in general, when it comes to colder climates, such as where I am in zone 3, the cold, in my opinion, and this is another one that is heavily argued, is a sterilizer. So if we look at the world of perennials all the way to the world of seeds, the intensity of the cold is neutralizing. Not all plants can make it through a winter, regardless of if they're in the right zone or not, if they're not protected correctly. And that is because the cold kills a lot of things off. That includes disease, pests, and plants that we want to keep around. In my opinion, if you leave your potting soil inside of the containers themselves, you haven't noticed anything very intense or invasive in the world of pest or disease. You're probably doing some sterilization just on its own, which again goes back to the reason why I did the video on how to revitalize potting soil, because regardless of how you store it, whether you solarize or you cool it down, you need to kind of bring some life back to it. If we ever wonder why my garden is not perfect, it's because of my nanimals. My nanimals, my children, they're bad. They're bad dogs. Okay, so while we observe broncs in the wild behind us, let's review what we just spoke about. Okay, so number one is we're going to take that potting soil and we are going to isolate it depending on whether it was an ornamental or a vegetable garden. Now, once we've isolated the two, we can then determine if there's been disease issues and whether or not we want to crop rotate. If there's been disease issues, we want to isolate it even further by taking it out of the pot, putting it into a clear plastic bag, and exposing it to very intense sun, aka very intense heat. This is going to sterilize said soil, and we can leave it in a space until next spring. Now, in the event we don't care so much about sterilization, but we care more so about what was in it and understanding what was in it, we may choose to label either an O for ornamental or V for vegetable, as an example. Now, once we determined that we know the difference between soil that's diseased and ornamental versus vegetable, we can then dig in a little bit further by determining how we're going to crop rotate in the spring to get us some benefit. So if you have a vegetable and you put P, or L is my preferred language, a VL on the outside of the container, that's an indicator that it was a vegetable that was a legume, and legumes are nitrogen fixers. So next year, something that's VL, so vegetable legume, can be moved into something that's a heavy feeder, such as a tomato, for example. Now, the reason for that is because they're nitrogen fixers, and nitrogen fixers, due to rhizobium bacteria, introduces more nitrogen. And despite popular belief, the actual nitrogen fixation and the microbe activity that takes place during this summer has no effect on this summer. It has effects on the summers going forward. So the reason for that is because while it fixes nitrogen into the soil, it takes time for that nitrogen to then be biodegraded and brought into bioavailability, which then can be used by the plant. So legumes are actually used for long-term plans and for the following year. So 1 to 2 to 3 years, depending on your climate and some other conditions like your soil, your moisture, etc., and so forth. So that may be an idea you want to consider. So legumes in particular, I may label a little bit separately. The next thing you might want to consider, and personally is probably one of the biggest struggles I have when it comes to potting soil and kind of how I decide what I'm doing with it, is the fact that potting soil, particularly peat or coconut coir based potting soils, are hydrophobic, and hydrophobicity comes from an environment that is incredibly dry. Now, while storing in a dry environment, particularly if that environment isn't going to freeze, is incredibly beneficial because you don't have a ton of microbe activity and therefore you're not going to have a ton of rot and fine, great, but I hate rehydrating potting soil. I hate it. It's the bane of my existence. So if you go that route, you may want to consider actually not storing it in a sealed container or in a way that, for example, where I am, falls are usually generally dry, and therefore any potting soil or soil that is in existence is incredibly dry, and therefore If you were to store that now and to put a lid on top, that soil is going to be very hard to hydrate in the spring. So my way of actually avoiding that entirely is to put it in the kiddie pool, or to leave kind of the top exposed, so that when it snows, you get the benefit of the extra water, and it saves you a little bit of time when it comes to rehydration in the spring. Now, the other thing, regardless of how you chose to go this, is actually revitalizing and reviving said potting soil, whether you're using organic methods or conventional methods, because we do not judge here on the Geek channel. You may want to consider watching this video right here, and if you care what Google thinks of you, that's what they say you've been searching, so check out that video right there. I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.